Alright, so here is another type of sky, kind of more of a stormy look, and I want to focus particularly on how to animate that, but also just try to give it a little bit more of that turbulent, messed up, stormy appearance, and how to make it seamless too, so you can have it loop endlessly. Right, so there's a number of different things going into this one, plus the fancy lens flares for the bright sun behind. In fact, we can make it even better and change the intensity based on how dark the clouds are that go right in front of it. So step back, we can do one level of undo here on the animation and see what we had before this last thing. The last thing we added here was in fact the lens flares, I believe. So once we have undone all that, there's about 250 frames in there. This is the grayscale animation before the lens flares were added. Let's get back to the very basics and the beginnings. Alright, so we start with nothing. We start with a free, no animation. And let's take something like a square-sized image. Something like this, 800 by 800. If you need it bigger, we can make, let's say, twice that size, 1600 squared. And of course, that will take longer to render and so on. But let's take a look at, for instance, starting with the plasma noise, and then put that plasma noise into a second layer. We call it the swap image or the swap buffer. It's basically another kind of the backside of the paint canvas that you're currently looking at. Right now we have this front image, the main image. You can see right here at the title, the top, it says main. If you switch over here, it goes over to the swap image, and that one's right now is blank. All right, so we have the two. You can also switch here from image, jump to the swap image. Right, shortcut J for jump, and you'll see that shortcut actually in a few other. Cosmigo, for instance, is a paint program that also does have that swap image concept that goes back to the days of long ago. When on the Amiga there was a great paint program called Deluxe Paint or D-Paint. And so we have that swap image, and in that swap image we can put, in fact, the exact same image there. Why not? So what I'm going to do is simply go to image and copy to swap image. So now we have the same. If I toggle between the main and the swap image, they are the same. The reason I do that is that the one that's in the swap image I'm going to use as a force field to displace the one that's in the main image. So that could be a different image now here. Right, I could go temporarily store this away, and there it is. So here's a save, not really a save, but a stored copy. And I'm going to perhaps just for sake of demo show something like let's go render some lines, a grid on top of this here, and perhaps a different color, a little bit easier to see. There you go. Right, and so now what I want to do is displace this image. Displace it by this gradient. Right, this image here can act as a force field. You do that from the filter menu, and there are a couple of ways to displace it. And so the very basic one here, the displace one here, you can see what it does. It displaces the image based on the underlying image in the swap image. Right, one that I really like a lot is, in this context for clouds, is the color twirl displays. And I invite you to try all of them. Some of them are great for some things, and some of them are greater for other things. Now the color twirl takes a little longer. It's not a real-time one at the time. It might in the future perhaps get onto the GPU. It's all a matter of prioritizing it, right? But it's fast enough, and what you can do is, let's go back to the original image without the grid and just see what it does to that. Right, so if you go and go to displace by swap and apply the color twirl displace, let's go, don't need a whole lot here. Now you're starting to look at, I don't know, clouds, like you're standing under the clouds, and there's some really heavy, nasty turbulence going on in this Texas superstorm clouds, right? Something that you can even animate. You can apply this distortion over an animation. I'm not going to do that quite yet here. Instead, I'm going to go take that and store that, and then perhaps I need it a bit more kind of in a perspective look. This is perhaps a look of really just looking right straight up the sky and under the clouds. It's not perfect yet, but it certainly is better than what we had before. And what I'm going to do, perhaps we could blur it a little bit, but what I'm going to do is give it a little bit of 3D perspective from the transform filter. With the 3D perspective, work on the rotation one way or another. And you can see with that, if you don't give it too much on the Y rotation, if you give it just a little bit on the X rotation, maybe you can give it something like this. So now you're looking up the sky, but also a little bit towards the horizon, right? But you see the seam, right? This is of course because we did not turn this image into a seamless image. We also have it repeating, and that's great. But the original tile is over here. We can move it back into the center, and there it is. All right, we can perhaps move it back a little bit further into distance, so we see actually the beginning of it. So here's this tile, and what we really want to do is be able to use it in a tile mode, repeating without seeing that edge. So let's go turn it into a seamless texture. All right, so here's that image. Let's go to the image menu and make seamless. And when you make this seamless, you can see how now it's being tiled, and it's already difficult to see where the seam is. But you can even make more of an overlap. If sometimes you have an image that's not a square shaped, sometimes you have it more like a very wide look or a very portrait style, vertical style. And so you may want to give it more overlap in one axis and less in the other axis. But when it's a square image, you probably want about the same in both directions. So let's say 14% overlap here. Keep the original size, so it's going to resize it or resample it to match that size. And now we have a perfectly seamless texture. I'm going to store that. So we have that next copy here. And the next stage is to look at the 3D perspective again, right here, 3D perspective, and simply rotate, no, not this axis, it's this axis here. All right, so now we don't see that seam anymore, can't tell exactly where it was. You may be able to see a repetitive pattern, right? You can see a little bit of a interference pattern there, due to the repetitive nature of this tile being, well, tiled. That's what the tile does. And but this is already pretty darn better than what we had before. All right, so now it's time to actually animate this. Right. So what we'll do is we'll turn this into an animation, create an animation, and for sake of brevity, I'm going to make it a little bit faster. Now I'm going to resample this half size. All right, resample to half size. 800 by 800 is still big enough for many users. I'm going to go now to animation create and say we need about 210. That will be 7 seconds long if we have 30 frames per second, right? 210 frames. And now how do we animate that? Well, I want these clouds to kind of whisk over my head eventually. So all I need to do is shift them, move them sideways or upwards. All right, so what I'll do is I'm going to go to the timeline for that. And with the timeline editor, you essentially have a collection very similar to these filters, right? Adjust, color, blur, photographic, and so on. Well, here you have filters. Adjust, group, color group, blur, photographic, and so on. So it's almost a mirror copy, but many of these parameters can be keyframed. Many of the parameters on these filters can be keyframed. Now, we're not going to need that a whole lot. What we'll do is we'll go down to the group for transforms, and there's a shift tool here. And with the shift filter, we can shift it one way or the other way. And again, it's seamless now, so you don't really see where the seam is as you shift it out. Let's reset it. And for the first frame here, that's where we start. Let's just keyframe that. Right? And then let's go to the last frame. And now if you have too many frames and it's a very fine granularity, you might want to resize this window a little bit, just so you have a better look and make sure you're really on the last frame here. And then I'm going to say, let's go vertically. Let's move it perhaps upward, right, or downward. We can change that. We can reverse the sequence later on. So let's not sweat it too much here. Let's make sure also we don't do 2 cycles. Let's see where this bright blob is here, or this diagonal one. We want to see that one appear again at the end. Yep, see, that would be going twice down. So let's go only down to about 100. That's 100% or 100 units. of the entire image. So that's probably going to give us the full animation we need to go across this entire image in one cycle of 210 frames. All right, let's keyframe that. So now we have a keyframe that is here at the beginning. We can, by the way, grab it and move it somewhere else if you want that to happen later. Right, you could perhaps have it stay steady for a while and only at some point start moving. Right, so lots of different ways to work with this timeline editor. And here's the last frame. We'll go and apply that. Make sure you have your save undo. That will save the image before the transform is applied, and it will do that for each frame, so the entire animation can be reversed, can be undone. And of course that takes a little bit of disk space and a little bit of time to write it to the disk, but it's worth that that extra time, unless you really know what you're doing and you don't need that extra millisecond time wasted. So let's see what we have here now. Here's a little animation, and it seems to be slowing down perhaps or coming back. It's because the default animation here was not a linear. I'm going to click that to linear, undo the transform and reapply. So now it's doing this as a linear interpolation. Before it was probably something like a spline or Bezier, some sort of a smooth interpolation. Now we have a more linear interpolation, so you should not see any sort of slowdown or acceleration or deceleration. Should be quite steady. The only thing that you might have is that the last frame may be at the same as the first frame, maybe not. It depends on how you know, what the frame was. You can actually go to the last one here and go beyond that to the next frame, and if you see it move, it's good, except it might be moving in the wrong direction, and I think this one does. So we overshot, right? We went to exactly the same position and then some, or just it looks like it's overshooting. So that's okay. We can then just delete that last frame or the first one. Right? So let's go here and delete that if we want to be perfectionist. You might not have noticed, so why care? Right? If you don't notice, probably the gamers that play your game may not notice. They are busy killing people here. We're looking at a stormy situation that's going to be in a FPS game, so let's not worry about that too much, right? So let's go and see what's the next step. Well, we wanted to put that into a perspective look, but before we do that, we know we may need to get a safe copy of this, because this is a milestone achieved. So let's go to animation and store. Just like we stored the image a few times, you can store this animation, and because it takes a lot of memory, you have a choice to actually store it to the disk. I always recommend that. Also, that way, if the program crashes, you can go to recover that DWA file, the dog waffle animation file that we just stored. This file, this animation lives on a file now, and there's a known place to find it if the program were to crash. And then you could actually recover it and load it right here from opening it. Right? I think I have a tutorial on that, by the way. So next thing I want to do is apply the perspective. And as we saw earlier, we could go here and go to apply perspective like this here and make it animate. Apply it to everything. So if we find the right angle, something like this, right? Then we could just animate it and apply that. But maybe you want to change the angle over the duration of this animation, right? So let's see if that same 3D animation exists here. Transform group, yep, 3D perspective, there it is. So now these numbers, these parameters are not exactly mapped to the same one. They're in a different order. So the one that was at the top is not going up, down, it's going sideways. Tiny little detail. All right, let's go and grab this one. That's the one we want to work on. And again, the beauty of this one is that we can actually change the intensity of that angle over time. We can vary it so that it's not a steady stream. Let's say we have some helicopters that are going to fly under these clouds, and they go towards the horizon down there. And we want to kind of change our angle, you know, from here to here as we follow them, as we look at them. So let's do that. Let's say something like this here. That will be the first angle. All right, something like this, and keyframe that, and then we go here towards the end and change the angle to something like this. There. keyframe that. And so now we apply that. And so now not only do we go through this animation that keeps moving, of course, frame by frame, but we also change the angle on that on that look, on that 3D perspective. And by the way, here's the texture U and V. You could actually do that shifting right in here as well. You didn't have to use that shift filter that we used a little bit earlier. Right? I'm showing you a couple of different steps, but you could actually have done this shift right in here. All right, so here is an interesting animation achieved, where we have, we have these clouds moving away from us, but we also kind of look down towards the horizon. All right, and maybe we want it in the opposite direction. All right, let's see what we can do about that. We can right-click here on the timeline and say reverse frames. Right, with reversing the frames, we essentially have reversed the order in which it goes. Now it goes like in the opposite direction. So now the frames are, the clouds are kind of moving towards us, and maybe we'll have the helicopters fly towards us as well. Or maybe they are still flying away, but we are, for any reason, we are lifting our head up to the skies. All right, so now let's give it a little bit more drama. And more drama might mean things like a little bit of haze and fog towards the horizon. We need to blur it there at the distance. There's a lot of aliasing, a lot of pixel aliasing here. That's texture aliasing. So we need to perhaps blur that a little bit, and not in the upper area where it needs to stay crisp. So what I'll do is I'll select this area here and blur just that area. Right. So what we'll do is something like using the, I don't know, a rectangle selection tool like this one here, and select about this entire area here. I'm going to show that with the overlay mode so we can really see what's been selected, and then I'm going to blur that selection. So I'm going to go to box filter or Gaussian blur alpha. Let's do box filter alpha and heavily blur this. Right, you can show the alpha that's being blurred, something like this. So you have a wide band that progressively makes the selection stronger and stronger. So now you can use that mask to select, to use the blur like the Gaussian blur, but just in that area. So up here it's not being blurred, and here it's not blurred yet, and then here it's not blurred a lot, but a little bit, and then it gets more and more blurred, and you can control, how much blurring you want on that. So what I'll do is say, well, okay, we can apply that across the entire animation, but because the animation is changing, we don't really want it to blur anymore once we're at that level. Right here at this point, it's okay to keep it all crisp. Here, we do need it blurred, but less than here. Here we need it blurred a lot. And so we need to basically keyframe the amount of blurring. We need to change how much blurring do we want over the duration of this animation. It's contained by the dimension, by the selection, but it also needs to be contained in intensity across the timeline. So that calls, of course, for the timeline. And with the timeline editor, you can find some blur tools here too. Blur for like Gaussian blur, and there's motion blur. There's a couple of others. I think Gaussian blur will be just fine here on this one. And what you can do is apply the blur here. You can see a little bit of blurring happening here, but it will not be the same amount of blur that you want. Once you're here, you see how it's blurred? You don't want that blur anymore, so you want to decrease it, right? So initially, give it a lot of blur. Give it all you got here. Give it the max, something like that. Keyframe that. And then by here, you say, oh, but that's too much. Let's go down a little bit, down to this level. Keyframe that. And then go to the very end, even at about here, you just want to stop that. No more blurring. Sorry, dude. Let's go out of here. Okay, so you have now a nice transition of 2 or 3 keyframes that say how much blurring you get at that point in the timeline, right? And apply that. So that's a classical example of where you really need more than applying a static filter across the entire animation. You need to have the keyframing capability in order to change how much of that filter effect you want at a particular time along the timeline. Right. And again, you can resize this window just to have a bit more granularity. If, for instance, you decide to move this thing around a little bit. One thing also that you can do is zoom in. There's a zoom here onto the timeline so that you can see even more. That's really useful if you're working on animations that have a couple of thousand frames, and you really need to start looking into finer details of where things are happening at what level. All right, so we have this part of the animation. Let's go store that one too. Let's go animation, store to disk. So we have this one here that we stored earlier. We now have a second one coming in where we do some blurring. And if the blurring is not enough, if you gave it too little, just apply it again. Right? You can do an undo if you didn't like it, but you can also apply again if the parameters are still good, or if you just say, well, regardless of, maybe I changed the parameters and I want to actually have more blurring, faster or less blurring, have these changes at the different moment in time along the timeline, and you can just apply that again, right? And then see if maybe that was too much. And if that was too much, then do undo. Keep in mind you have only one level of undo for the animation, right? This is a lot of frames to keep on the disk, and we keep just one of those, one sequence on that. But you can see now that there's a tremendous amount of blurring here. Let's get rid of the alpha. Let's store it for just the time being. Store alpha. We can keep that alpha selection mask here just in case we want to get back to it. And then we go to clear the alpha or hit Control D. And so now we can safely watch this animation and determine if it's too much blurring or if it's just fine. Right, okay, and so let's say now you can see the blur goes away and now it's crisp all over. So maybe it was too much at the very end. We did see a little bit of blur here. So let's go to undo. We have one level of undo we can enjoy. Let's use it. And so now here, so here's one where perhaps we do need to blur some more, but in a more tighter area here, a smaller area. So that's where you can replace this alpha mask and say, no, actually that one's too liberal, right? We don't need to go that high. This demarcation line, this marching ants, is showing the halfway of the selection mask. It still goes up higher. So maybe we need to make this a little bit tighter. You can redo the rectangle selection, or you could go to the selection and transform the alpha and actually see what that alpha looks like here, right? And say, for instance, not transform it, sorry, adjust. Selection, adjust alpha, there it is. You want to adjust the alpha so that you can see perhaps the contrast, bring it down a little bit so it's a little bit closer to this area and doesn't fade down into the upper area of the image. So you can adjust that with gamma and with the contrast. So that gives you a little bit of adjusting control here on the selection mask. And let's see, I'll use something like this here. Okay, so that's a smaller alpha, and I'm going to apply that one more time. Something like that. Apply. Alright, so at this point we have a animation that we can go to the next step for the clouds, and that next step is to add perhaps additional turbulence. Right? You do want to see this kind of animation, but you still want to also have these clouds kind of move a little bit on their own. And so there's a couple of ways to do that. I'll show you one here. I'll talk about the different technique in the next tutorial, but it's usually used more for cartoonish animations. This one here, well, remember we have this selection here. I mean, in the swap image we had this thing. We can still use that as a displacement map, even in the timeline editor. We could go here, for instance, and find a group of combine with swap, and then a group of composite and displace by swap. Right? And so we don't have that many here, but we do have the pool displace and the regular displace, and you can get an idea of what's happening here. This will displace based on what's in the swap image. Now, because it's moving, it's going to displace against a moving target. The background is going to be static, but the foreground is moving, so that creates a displacement that seems to be animated. So that's an interesting technique. There's also the pool displace that looks very good for anytime you work with water. Try that one as well. And so sometimes for a very thick atmosphere where you might want to make it look a bit like water, that could also be quite useful. Squirrel factor, funny names here. But let's try this one here. Let's try the cloaking display. Cloaking may have a little bit of a coloration. No, actually not too bad here. Let's try that. Right. And then the other thing too is that the amount of displacement that you see, the intensity may be fine here, but maybe too much down at the horizon. If you want that to appear smaller, difficult, but you can kind of convey a bit of that impression if you at least reduce the intensity of it. Right. So you can apply the selection mask on that as well. For instance, use the right click here to do a linear selection fader, and say select everything here at the top, start from about here, gradually fading. So the selection here now is no longer fully present, and so there should be no displacement here, but here there should be a lot of displacement, and that's exactly what we'll do. Let's use the regular displace tool here, and so you'll see a lot of displacement here, and it's gradually fading, not in distance but in intensity. That's what the alpha channel does here. And so as you apply that, you will see some apparent movements here. And again, this is one we actually, let me do an undo. This is one because of the change in the angle where we look. We should actually change the intensity here. The max displace should perhaps gradually fade away. Or this calls for the alpha channel itself to fade. Actually, that's what we should do. And there are techniques to do that where the selection mask itself comes from an animation. I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial, but you can definitely have a selection mask that also animates as the animation itself is subjected to the filter. So I think that's that part. I'm going to leave it with just a little bit displacement. And you know what, let's do that without the selection mask and keep it simple and just do that. Alright, so we have a little bit of displacement, and what I'll do next is to add a little bit of God rays or rather lens flares, and that's where perhaps the final touch will be given for the visual you want. Right, so you have the last of the filters in the animation group here, animated lens flares, and when you do that you can adjust the intensity of the lens flare, and you can also give it actually lens flare settings will let you choose a variety of different lens flares, and I've created a few more. You can actually save those. You can go into editing those and creating a lot of different options for those lens flares to create very different looking lens flares. And so if I select this one, it'll be this very radiant look. If you look, this one is nice because you see how the rays move as you change the position, so that creates a very nice distraction on that bright flare. Here's a couple of others. I love those dim ones. They're not that dim really, and they can be bright, right? And so that's an interesting one to look at as well. The reddish ones. There you go. Let's try that. Okay. Actually, no, let's not try that quite yet. I went too fast. I wanted to show you one more thing before we do the final lens flares, and that is to add some God rays I mentioned earlier. It's called Mystic Vision in the blur group. Right. Now imagine the zoom blur first. If you did the zoom blur, you'd go into a position, let's say up above, and then apply a strong amount of zoom blur. Both the dark and the bright ones are zoomed in the zoom blur. Right? You can change the quality and especially the factor, the intensity of that zoom blur. But that creates an interesting effect, but it oftentimes is a little bit too blurry now because it applies it to all pixels regardless of their intensity. If they're black or if they're white, if they're gray, anything in between, they're all moved and affected by that. One that is interesting in that to avoid much of that blurriness is to go to the dark vision or the mystic vision. And in the mystic vision, it's the bright ones that prevail. So you see the bright ones are being lifted, and the zoom blur effect is carrying them away, but the bright ones are not. The dark ones are not affected. So that is what you can use to make it look like there is a sun or something bright behind it here, and it's casting rays. But because we change our camera, remember we lifted our head towards the upper part, we need to also do that on the rays and perhaps actually have it move down. Right? So over time, what we'll do is we'll go initially, will be right up here. This part is, let's say the sun is going to be right in this area here, and we'll keyframe that. And then towards the bottom, the sun still needs to be here, but because we want to make it look like our camera direction is moving up, the sun needs to go down towards the bottom of the frame, right? Something like that. And perhaps very low down there. Okay, and keyframe that. So now you have an animation that makes it a little bit more credible, right? And apply that. And one thing to keep in mind is that we can cast those light rays, right? And we can do that 1 or 2 more times. We can also cast the dark rays. That sometimes will give you some really nice, almost like volumetric shadows, dark vision. And keep the same parameters. So, well, okay, it doesn't carry them forward. You're going to have to figure out where was that hot spot, where was that center point, right? Keep an eye on that. And place it around here and keyframe it. Perhaps adjust the intensity a little bit if you want longer, darker clouds. Keyframe that. And then go to the bottom down here and keyframe that, and perhaps, I don't know, reduce the intensity a little bit. Keep it crisper. So this one here is going to look a little bit different, and let me just apply it. We can check it and then undo it if we don't like it. But this is where you can experiment with a variety of different effects from either the dark side being cast like shadows, or the bright side being cast like light rays that are being caught in the humid atmosphere. So here is that appearance. That one's a little bit too washed out for my taste, so I'm going to undo that and just leave it with the light rays that we had a little bit earlier. Okay, so now that we have that, one more. Oh yeah, we can do a couple of other filters. There's one in the photographic group called the dark diffusion as well. If you want this to have a little bit more of a dark look, well, give it some dark diffusion. Allow the dark parts to prevail a little bit, to permeate into the bright parts. So there's a light diffusion, and here is a dark diffusion. That takes a little while, that takes a little time, be patient, but that can add another level of drama to it as well. If the mood needs to be in the dramatic, you can definitely see using that as well. The dark side just as much as the light side. If you want the light diffusion or the brighter parts to kind of give you a bit of a glary look, right? That's actually a good way to do it. And then there's a ton of other post-level works you can do to that. If you think about just the regular filters here, like adjusting the curves, there's a lot of different mood you can get from that. Saturate it, give it a little bit more contrast. And when you have this and you say that's exactly what I'm looking for, maybe add some rainfall to that or a snowstorm or whatnot, animate that, it will apply that to the entire image sequence. All right, so let's say that's what we want to do, and let's say that was actually not what we want to do that. How do we undo this? Well, we still have this thing, and it remembers the prior. It doesn't remember what we just did before here, but it does remember this one. It has that, so we can undo that and get back to that level as well. So keep that one in mind in case you are desperate to go back in time by one level of undo. That one most likely has something you can go back to. Also, always go back to saving something to the disk, right? Have your current animation as a snapshot in a stored copy. And so here we have already 3 animations now. And if you ever want to go back to them, right? If you want to go back to this one, just click this here, and that restores it. So here's that animation before we even did the 3D perspective. Here's the animation after we did the 3D perspective. And here's the animation with 3D perspective and then some. Right here we have the light diffusion added, and or rather the mystic vision. All right, I think it's time for the final touch, and that's to add the sun rays with the lens flares. And so the lens flares is coming up here, and we have a collection of lens flares we can show here with the flare setting. And what I'd like to do is just explore some of them, place it here. This has a nice little halo. Adjust the intensity a little bit to see if you like that. And really the thing is, sometimes you have just a very different need here. So if you just want to have it kind of a washed out blur, or if you want something like a nicely contained reddish sun like this one, choose what you want, and if it's not there yet, make it so. You can create your own lens flares. You can create and adjust the parameters, and then at some point call it a day and say, okay, here's my lens flare, let's go and adjust it. Now you're going to not want to have it just static there. First of all, it needs to move downwards with the picture, right? As you're moving your head up, you want the sun to be bright up here, and keyframe that a little bit bright like that. And then towards the end of the animation, it needs to stay down there where the lens flares are, where the rays are emanating from as well. And so you can do that. You can reduce the intensity to make it look like it's a little bit farther away from your side of view now. Keyframe that. And you might think you're almost done here, but there's another thing you might want to do, and that's to convey. Come on, let's take a look at that one. Let's apply that just to see if that's good enough. The thing though I'm thinking is that we probably should modulate the intensity of the lens flare a little bit, because sometimes it might almost disappear behind some some dark clouds, right? So here's what we do so far without that extra processing. And so let me do undo and actually go through that and see what else we could do. When we hit a dark cloud, we see right now here there's a dark cloud about to come in front of the sun. The sun is around here. Right, let me paint that. Oops, no, I'm not using the paint tool here at the moment. Let me just paint this to visualize this. The sun is around here, right? And what I'd like to do is see that this cloud is going to make the sun dimmer, and maybe not totally disappear, but just dimmer. That will add a little bit there. At this point here, I need to reduce the intensity, something like that, and keyframe that, right? And then at some point, the cloud moves away, or maybe it gets a little bit brighter. Keyframe that, gets darker again a little bit later, and I might want to reduce it, right? Something like that. Keyframe that here, and then go here. We have a spot where suddenly it has an opening, but the sun is down here now, so we need to keep looking where is the sun supposed to be at that point, right? So here maybe is a spot where it brightens up again, and then here it gets darker again. So you see how you can create a whole sequence of different lens flares, intensity levels, right? And so if you do this, it may add a level of convincing simulation of brightness changes, right? Now, if you also have other things in the scene, they should get darker or brighter too, based on how much the sun is hitting them, right? So there's a lot more you can do to give it that level of realism. And then in the end, if you say, well, I want that to be, let's go store this quick. This is a nice milestone achieved. So let's say we want to also add something like make this whole thing look like a grayscale image. Maybe we're working in noir and we want to make it grayscale. So here's one, the grayscale conversion from the image menu, and you can either take the average level, video weighted, or expose through lens, which I like a lot, because then you can see a slightly different effect depending on which color you're tuning to. If you have a lot of blue or a lot of red, you can adjust what level of gray you want for those, and okay that, and apply that to the whole animation. So now you have a nice grayscale animation of this. All right, well, I think that sums it up. There's a very different sky here. There's always more you can add to it, and in fact I'm tempted. Okay, I'll do one more. That's the snowfall, right? With the snowfall, you have essentially the ability to do some level of storm conditions in the sky here, You can adjust how much snow you get. You can change the velocity, and if you make it go, that's the vertical velocity. If you make it go faster, it will look a bit more like heavy snow or actually rain. And then if you want it like rain, maybe you want to change the brightness of it so it's dark. And then also the size of it, make it small. And the turbulence, probably not much turbulence, unless, well, you want some of that turbulence to be conveyed here. And then the wind speed, that's a lateral or sideways movement. So if you want to make it look like there's wind coming from the right, blowing this to the left, you want to go here. And that again is something you could keep like this, or you could adjust with keyframes some amount of changes in the wind in which that the raindrops are falling, right? But let's do a simple one here and simply do this rainfall like that and see what we got here. Okay, so that already looks even more dramatic now. Now you have some stuff falling down here. It's a little bit too slow. Let's go undo that. And let's see what we got here. Increase the velocity of the raindrops a little bit. That's what we need to do. And perhaps have the size. Well, let's keep the size as is and apply that. And so that's coming really close to final. Now the raindrops are moving fast, so now you can actually see a sequence of a couple of dots here, right? It's not a perfect line. And you might want to use other tools to add more realistic and more variances, different types of rain and snow. There's actually a plugin that you can get from AnyFX, AnyFX for Dog Waffle, that includes some more rain and snow capabilities that can also go in different directions and has more control of that. But what you can do here is pretty darn good already for starters. One thing you could do is add a little bit of motion ghosting, right? If you use a ghosting of 3 or 4 frames, then this moving sequence of dots, these raindrops, will look a little bit more like streaks, and that's perhaps one more level that we can apply here. So let's see what that gives us. A few more seconds. There. And it's very messy, and that's what it is like when you look up at the sky and it's raining down on you, right? So let's call this the final animation. You know, it's never final, of course. I mean, you see some turbulence here at the bottom that causes a little bit of edge effect. You might need to crop some of that. You might need to blur it or to adjust the size. I always recommend working with an image that's a little bit bigger than what you really need at the end, so you have some margins you can crop off. And I'll do that for my final here. I'll say go to the crop tool and say give me something that's roughly 16:9, like an HD. Perhaps I'll have the sun outside of my view at the beginning, right? And I'll go something like that, crop that. And then once I've done that, I want to make sure it is really the right dimensions, so I'm gonna go and resample it. I never hit it right from the first one, so I'm gonna go and resample there, and see, it's not exactly 800. Let's go keep the constraints and see if I make it 640. Oh, I got actually quite a bit of margin. I wanted that to be 640 by 360. I could actually crop some more off of that. All right, so let's do that. Let's go back to the crop tool and give it another something like that. Move it down a little bit and crop. And maybe this time I took too much out. I mean, that's where you want to be careful that you have a backup copy, right? Store often, save often, store often, and then see if we have the final resample. Let's now go with 640 by, let's go, yeah, I overshot a little bit here, 640 by 360, what I wanted, but nobody will notice if you make that 360, right? You don't have to hit it exactly. That will still be looking good. Another thing you could do is say, well, let's not even go that slow. Let's go 768, and then here make it about 412. You don't want to have an odd number in your dimensions. That's bad for any codec. If you save it out to AVI, if you save it out to anything, convert that AVI to something else. Many codecs, many video formats will not be happy with odd dimensions in width or height. You always want to make it an even number, and preferably even a multiple of 4, not just multiple of 2. Make it a multiple of 4 or 8. Most codecs work best at that. Some codecs only work with multiple of 8 or multiple of 16 even. Right? So it's always something to keep an eye on if you've done some cropping and didn't hit it exactly on the numbers you wanted. So let's go and make this final resampling, and that's the one I would then call done. At that point I will save that. There it is. So at that point I have this animation with a very different sky, and the sun coming down, our head kind of moving up, and it's ready for prime time. Now it's ready for, let's say, compositing with an army of helicopters flying over our heads, for instance, right, or something of a different nature. All right, so thanks for watching.